Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us in person and online. My name is Pomerleau. I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy at the American Action Forum. I'll be moderating today's event. Over the next 2 hours, we'll be discussing one single question. Should the EPA's endangerment finding be reversed? 2009 endangerment finding concluded that greenhouse gases pose harm to public health and welfare. It has since served as the legal basis for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The Trump administration has proposed to repeal this finding earlier this year. What are the implications of that? Today, we have a distinguished panel to help us navigate these complex issues. Please allow me to introduce our panelists. To our far left, Michael Bushbacher, a partner at Boyden Gray, who served at the U.S. Department of Justice as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division. Matt Leopold, a partner at Hunton Andrews Kurth and former general counsel for the EPA. Roger Pielke Jr., a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, previously a professor at the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Benjamin Zycher, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, former adjunct professor of economics at the University of California, Los Angeles. We'll listen to each of the panelists to give us about 15 to 20-minute presentations. After that, we'll have a panel discussion with all our panelists to dive into some of the points raised in their presentations. In the last 10-minute or 15-minute or so, we'll take some questions from the audience. So please get your questions prepared. We'll first hear from Michael, and then Matt, and then Roger, and Ben. Welcome.
Thank you. So it's the first time I think I've been described as being on the far left, so it's first time for everything. So I'm going to start with the kind of summary of what's going on, how we got here, because it's 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, and presumably most of you would not normally just be digging into the minutia of Clean Air Act regulations. So I want to set the table a little bit. A few initial things, right? The current EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin, has called the endangerment finding the holy grail of the environmental left. Because it is the fundamental point that basically all of the subsequent greenhouse gas regulations, emissions regulations that the agencies put out, it's what those are all based on. And to give an idea of the stakes, the EPA under the Biden administration projected its most recent standards for motor vehicles would result in 70% of new light-duty vehicles being electric, from like 10% right now. And 45 of new heavy-duty vehicles from like 0 right now. And a $900 billion price tag, which is totally an underestimate. I mean, among other things that they didn't count, we talked about this earlier, was they didn't count the cost of the EV tax credits. Of course, those are gone now. So those are definitely real costs. The typical playbook for an incoming Republican administration with that kind of thing would be to, undo it, do something more reasonable. And that's kind of what the Trump 1.0 approach was, but it's not Trump 1.0 anymore. They are working to break the tool itself, and I'm going to get to the detailed summary, but I will kind of give you my top line point here at the beginning, which is I think the Trump folks are right. I think they're right about what the law actually says. I think they're right that the scientific arguments that Democrats have advanced don't hold water sufficient to justify the policies that they're going for. And I think they're right that the current system does not work, that it's very dysfunctional, it doesn't fit well with what the Clean Air Act is designed to do. Of course, being right is not enough. And there are a lot of pitfalls that are on the way that they could fall into. And Matt and I have enjoyed the phrase, could be kind of a regulatory Vietnam. I think that's probably too gloomy. I think I will say that maybe it's like a regulatory Everest, right? It's dangerous. It's a high risk, high reward endeavor, and it has great symbolic importance. So two final throat clearing things. One, I'm just here on behalf of myself, not any of my clients. And this is not about believing in climate change or anything stupid like that, like it were a religion. Washington has a syllogism: we need to do something. This is something. Therefore, we need to do it. Climate science and climate policy are too important to get wrong. So let me jump into to how this all works. So Title II of the Clean Air Act is what governs mobile sources, and 202A is where this endangerment finding language is, and it makes EPA prescribe standards for the emission of any air pollutant from new motor vehicle engines that, in the administrator's judgment, cause or contribute to air pollution that may be reasonably anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. The standards apply throughout the entire useful life of the vehicle, and EPA has to consider lead time and costs. It has very broad discretion. It's not a technology forcing mandate. There's a case about aircraft emissions regulation recently from the DC Circuit that made that pretty clear, looking at an analogous provision in the Clean Air Act. Air pollution, welfare, right, these are things that include anticipated dangers, not just things that are shown to exist right now. And it can also include climate effects. The statute uses the word climate from pollutant combinations. So for a long time, 1970 to 2009, the EPA looked at what we think of typically as pollutants: nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and not greenhouse gases. But in this Massachusetts versus EPA case that everyone always talks about, the court said that that as an unambiguous interpretation of the statute, air pollutant includes greenhouse gases, and it rejected a number of arguments, including the major questions argument, kind of an earlier version of it. One sort of important distinction there is they looked to congressional inaction as a way of saying that this was not a major question. The more recent West Virginia versus EPA case actually does the exact opposite, so there are some pretty serious methodological changes that have happened in the intervening years. And they also said that there was no problem with the fact that the Department of Transportation regulates fuel economy. Of course, actually, those are two sides of the same coin. Greenhouse gas emissions is actually, carbon emissions is actually how you measure fuel economy. By seeing how much carbon comes out of the tailpipe per unit of work, you can see how efficient an engine is. So they're regulating the same thing, but with different statutes and with different rules, and the Supreme Court kind of gave that the back of the hand and said it didn't matter too much. It also made the point, the court made the point about scientific judgment, and so it didn't actually say that EPA had to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles, but it said that the agency couldn't not consider whether there was an endangerment to public health and welfare. So following Massachusetts, Obama EPA comes in and issues the 2009 endangerment finding for 6 what they called well-mixed greenhouse gases. The reason they did that is water vapor is the most powerful greenhouse gas there is, but it's not well-mixed in the atmosphere the way that these other ones are. The main ones are carbon dioxide and methane. Pursuant to that finding, Obama EPA and Department of Transportation issued joint tailpipe greenhouse gas rules / fuel efficiency standards, and they were harmonized. The Trump administration, the first time around, did something similar, but rolled back the stringency quite a bit, but did still set standards. Biden administration kind of changed its approach to this. So you could see here one important point is that the rules under both Obama and the first Trump administration encouraged making conventional vehicles more efficient, but they didn't actually mandate any kind of change in what kind of vehicles, what kind of fuels and drivetrains you had to use. And that changed with the Biden years. What they did is they moved to reverse engineering an electric vehicle mandate. This was something that the president talked a lot about. And the way they did this, they didn't say we're going to mandate electric vehicles and here's the percentage you have to hit. They sort of reverse engineered it. And this should be familiar. It's what the Obama administration did on the stationary source side of things for the Clean Power Plan, where you use an averaging cap and trade system. You set standards below what could be met by the conventional technology. And then by using averaging, people have to either buy credits or phase out what they're doing and put in new stuff to meet those new targets. So similar strategy for the EV mandate stuff. As I mentioned before, the costs were utterly enormous. The EPA estimate was $900 billion, which is, like, for many different reasons, a gross underestimate. Probably, I think that is the most expensive rule that was ever put out by any agency. And would have tremendous effects. It's not often that you hear, the specifics of a regulation's effects being discussed on in the first, 10 minutes of a presidential nomination acceptance speech, but President Trump was talking about it precisely because it was such a big deal. This shows how that works, right? It's sort of you have deficits for conventional vehicles and credits for electric vehicles. So over time, you have to increase the number of electric vehicles you sell, or you have to buy credits from Tesla. That $900 billion figure, or multi-trillion dollar, if you actually were honest about it, figure probably explains why Elon has gotten the pay package recommendation that he has recently. So now what, right? I think the case for repeal that I'm going to try to make is grounded in, this is a dysfunctional system that needs to be changed. It's continuing to spiral out of control and to do bad things. So the idea of the Trump administration here is, I think we're just gonna break that tool. There are a couple of different rationales in the proposal that EPA put out back on, I think, August 1st. One is they have like a legal rationale. There's no authority under Section 202A of the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions or to do climate regulation. There's a second alternative scientific rationale that basically scientific knowledge has developed since 2009, undermining some of the key points of that finding, and that justifies departing from that conclusion. And then they have a couple of other arguments that don't really engage directly with endangerment, but that would still get rid of the regulations they're trying to repeal. They also rely on this climate working group paper from the Department of Energy. There's sort of drama about that has actually not been, that group has been dissolved, but its paper is still out there, and it's still an important part of, I'm sure Roger can talk about this too, like it's still an important part of how they're thinking about things. So primary legal rationale that they have, that the text and structure focus on local and regional pollutants, that you have to have sort of proximate or close causation between the emission that you're looking at and what's gonna risk harming human health and welfare. And then this point about the major questions doctrine, that this is such an important thing, you would expect Congress to have spoken more clearly than it did. They also have some objections to how the 2009 finding was written. They don't really get into this in their proposal, but I still think it's an important point. The Biden era rules, so the Department of Transportation can't consider electric vehicles when it's setting standards. EPA says it can, or at least it has under the Biden administration. And so because of that disconnect in how the statutes are written, the regulations are no longer harmonized. It was kind of the Gwyneth Paltrow conscious uncoupling. They actually used the word, we're going to decouple our regulations, which I thought was pretty funny. That's an argument that sort of goes to a factual point that Massachusetts made. The scientific rationale, second scientific rationale, I think some of the key criticisms that the IPCC data that they were looking at of like a 1.8 to 4 degree increase by 2100 was unduly pessimistic. Points like in 1930s is when heat waves were at their highest, that you have urban heat confounding variables, like you've got heat islands in cities that change things, and that cold mortality is a much bigger deal, basically because now we have air conditioning, at least in the United States. They also talk about CO2 benefits, that there are some benefits that were not adequately discussed in the endangerment finding in 2009, and that the 2009 finding didn't look at adaptation and just sort of cabin that, which was a mistake and didn't, skewed how they looked at things. And they also make this point, which is pretty important, about that it's just de minimis. U.S. on-road vehicles were 2.8% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the total fleet. It's not, you could probably slice that more thinly and say, what is the new, because this is about each model year's new production of vehicles. So that's a much smaller chunk even of that. So we can talk about this more if folks are curious about it. There are a number of other issues that are in play that kind of just go to other reasons why these rules should be rescinded, but not necessarily because of endangerment. One is, the most important, I think, is that the fuel switching argument from going from liquid fuels to electricity is a major question. If it was a major question in the stationary source context, stands to reason that would be a major question in the mobile source context. And so there's, again, some tension with that in Massachusetts, but I think that's a pretty good argument. They also make the point that there's just nothing here that's going to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they also claim that turnover, in other words, when you increase costs, people don't buy new vehicles as much, and that change in turnover means that you actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. EPA's modeling has not borne that out, but that modeling is probably BS. So I'm not sure if it's right, but I don't think they've quite explained it yet. And then another point is that the Clean Air Act is actually written in such a way as to not authorize averaging, banking, and trading. It's not written like the corporate average fuel economy law. It's written differently. And so the whole scheme here of doing averaging to reverse engineer outcomes that you want is based on a faulty statutory premise. One fallback position I'll just flag that they could do is they could put out alternative standards under DC Circuit precedent. You have to regulate if you're EPA, so I don't think they can, if they lose on endangerment, I don't think they can have an alternative rationale that says we're just not going to regulate. So they probably should do something in the alternative if they want to have kind of a fallback. The downside, of course, is that is a ton of work and kind of gives credence to the idea that they can and should regulate this stuff. One very big issue that's in play that I'll also flag is, like, if endangerment goes away, what does that mean for states? So there's a case called AEP versus Connecticut that says that because the Clean Air Act regulates greenhouse gases, which it unquestionably does. There are parts of it that unquestionably do. The renewable fuel standards, there are regulations of methane, things like that, that are expressed in the statute. Because it regulates those things, it displaces federal common law. And the argument from there is like, well, because federal common law preempts state law, if you've got federal statutory law coming in and displacing the common law, that federal law has to preempt the state law too. So all these climate superfund laws that you see at the state level, those kind of things are illegitimate. But there's a risk, at least, of causing confusion in the way that they do this. The proposed rule does talk about preemption and says that because the greenhouse gases can be regulated, that preemption is still in place. That's kind of in tension with some of the other stuff they say in the rule, though, so they're going to have to clarify that if they want to make it stick. So yeah, the regulatory Everest, like, what is it going to work? What do we think about it? I think, as an original matter, if you're just reading the Clean Air Act, this is correct. It is very strange to be using this 1970 statute to be setting climate policy. It doesn't work. We're not actually reducing carbon emissions. It's extremely costly. And the cases that have upheld this are wrong. And I think there's a path forward here that doesn't create the chaos some folks have worried about. And if we want to get back to actually changing things to the way they should be, as opposed to just kind of fiddling around the edges and trying to make things less destructive, I think taking the endangerment finding head on is very important. And it's very, very, it's going to be a difficult road for them because they're going to be in the DC Circuit at first. That's where the final rule will be challenged. That's not a favorable venue for this administration. And only then can they go to the Supreme Court. I read them as basically trying to take a very narrow reading of Massachusetts versus EPA, so it kind of tees up a fight at the Supreme Court. Of course, the Supreme Court doesn't have to take these cases, so they have to, kind of like Odysseus, they have to shoot through several different axe heads at once to hit the target. Whether they'll be able to do that or not is an important question. If they fail in it, the costs that are from these regulations they're trying to get rid of are still going to be there, and they're enormous, and that would be really bad. But I think, kind of like Everest, I think it's worth attempting, and I think the symbolic importance of getting rid of sort of stupid regulation is really important in and of its own, as sort of a separate point, regardless of how many billions and trillions of dollars you put in the cost column. Realigning how we do climate regulation and how we do environmental regulation seems to me a very worthwhile task, and I think the administration should be commended for taking it on.
Great. All right. Thank you, Michael, that was a great presentation on kind of the outline of where we are, what's at stake. Just a quick introduction to me. I'm Matt Leopold. And of most relevance to this conversation, I served as the General Counsel of EPA under the first Trump administration from 2018 to 2020. And during that time, as Michael pointed out, the administrator did not choose to revisit the endangerment finding, but it was widely reported it was under consideration. And ultimately, the agency focused on other actions to try to more traditional tools of regulatory approaches. We really focused on repealing the Clean Power Plan. And I was involved in the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was the EPA rule that led to but West Virginia v. EPA, that announced the Major Questions Doctrine, which really is a key element of this proposal as well. And then the approach in Trump 1 was also a pollutant-specific contribution finding that looked at whether certain sectors could be ruled out of regulation under the Clean Air Act because the contributions were not significant and so small. There's flavors of that, and EPA is also working on a power plant rule that deals with that theory as well in a different section of the Clean Air Act. So some of the seeds were laid back in the first term, but now it's come to full fruition. And in fact, what started this off on day one, the president issued an executive order that specifically called for revisiting the endangerment finding, and so that's what kicked all this off. So you've obviously, the key elements here in the background are in 2007, Mass v. EPA, that I happened to start at the Justice Department that year when that decision came down, and so it was a major impact at DOJ and when that decision came down. The endangerment finding in 2009, EPA's tailpipe rules, then the Coalition for Responsible Regulation case, which we'll talk about, that upheld the endangerment finding in the DC Circuit, and then a number of EPA rulemakings hinge and rely on the 2009 endangerment finding, including rules under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, which regulates other sectors other than transportation. We're not just talking about here, we're talking mostly about vehicle emission standards, which are, transportation represents the largest amount of emissions from domestic sources, but, also EPA had previously grounded its findings for other sectors like the power plant sector in the endangerment finding. So, I think, this administration came at this well organized, ready to address this question on day one. Certainly a much different approach than what happened back in 2017 and 2018. As Michael pointed out, you should look at the endangerment finding as a cornerstone that and the theory, it seems, of the current administration is if they can undermine that cornerstone, then all the house of cards that are built upon it will fall. And so in one fell swoop, they could eliminate greenhouse gas regulation by and large, not across the entire agency. But in doing so, I think, I see in this proposal, they're also saying that this approach could be read to be consistent with Mass v. EPA, which is very clear that greenhouse gas is a pollutant under the Act. They don't take that on directly. It stands. The Supreme Court, has decided and has had chances to revisit that in various cases and has declined to do so, notably in the AEP v. Connecticut case, which considered whether or not federal common law preempted the field, or the federal common law cases were preempted by the Clean Air Act. And so, the way I come at this is the Clean Air Act still is a comprehensive regulatory framework, and that preempts the field for regulation of GHGs from a federal perspective. But that doesn't mean Congress didn't choose on a specific basis how and whether and if to regulate. And what EPA is saying here is that the endangerment finding under 202A has certain constraints that were ignored by the Obama administration in 2009. And they're trying to reassert, hey, the language is very specific, that they were blown, some of the constraints were blown past. And I'm going to get into a couple of those and expound a little bit more on some of the rationale that Michael mentioned. But I think we have to ask ourselves the question, why does this administration think that there might be a likelihood of success in going forward right now? One, obviously, is the Supreme Court, who's on the Supreme Court at present. The 5 justices who ruled on Mass v. EPA are no longer on the court, and 3 of the dissenters who dissented from Mass v. EPA, including the Chief Justice Roberts, are still on the court. I'm sure that figures into the calculus here. But I would suggest the other consideration is really, we've had, since 2007, when Mass v. EPA came down, we've had an administrative law revolution. That revolution and I use that word intentionally, and I don't think it's hyperbole. And 4 of those cases figure very prominently in EPA's explanation of their proposal. So that's UARG v. EPA in 2014, which again didn't undermine the conclusion that greenhouse gas can be regulated, but it did say in the particular program they were trying to apply that EPA overread its authority and it couldn't regulate GHGs for very small sources. Michigan v. EPA in 2015 came down and said EPA must consider all factors, including costs, where you have words like whether it's appropriate to regulate. Then West Virginia v. EPA announced the Major Questions Doctrine in 2022. And it's a clear statement rule, essentially, that if for questions of economic or political significance, there must be clear authority, clear statement in the statute. And then capping it off, in 2024, the Loper-Bright case from the Supreme Court, which got rid of Chevron deference to agency interpretations of statutes and required a single best interpretation, and no deference to agency interpretation or reliance on silence in a statute. So the playing field, if you will, about what the playing field that the Obama administration was playing on in 2007, it looks entirely different today in the legal landscape. And so, it's no surprise that the administration is leaning heavily into these cases. And first and foremost, I think the major questions doctrine case is prominent, West Virginia, and they propose to attack it in a couple ways, the endangerment finding using major question. They say there's no clear authority in the Clean Air Act 202A to address global climate change concerns. Just the statute doesn't say that, and it was asserted in the endangerment finding, but it's not clear. And then they also make the argument that Michael laid out on the EV mandate, and say even if it could address global climate concerns, it certainly doesn't mandate generation shifting and a wholesale change of the fleet of vehicles and how they're powered and the powertrains that exist. So that is really, we don't know how EPA might finalize that, and comments are flooding in currently from all sides. But I think this concept specifically of appropriate constraints, whatever you think about whether Congress intended to use this section to regulate a international issue of climate change, whatever you think about that, there are certain constraints that are going to be, in my estimation, read more narrowly by a textualist judges and originalist judges that are looking at the words of the statute, not just the purpose potentially of what the Clean Air Act is supposed to address with respect to pollution. I'll highlight what I think is probably one of the most important arguments that EPA makes as well, and that is this notion that in 2009 the Obama administration said it took the approach of doing a standalone endangerment finding that was divorced from standard setting. Okay, that was a break in EPA tradition and in traditional approaches, and by divorcing the standard setting function of EPA on how we're going to regulate from this scientific determination, the Trump EPA now says that really introduced a host of errors that occurred. Some of them very significant and are part of the basis of revisiting. So those errors that flowed were that, prominently, I mentioned earlier Michigan v. EPA, the Supreme Court precedent that says EPA must consider cost if the statute asks it to engage in a multi-factor analysis, like a cost-benefit type of analysis. And the EPA absolutely considers cost when it did the tailpipe rules that flowed from the endangerment finding. This EPA now faults the endangerment finding, saying that given that they knew in 2009 that it would lead to billions and billions of costs on our economy, and in light now of what the Supreme Court has clarified in the Michigan case, they should have done a full-throated, full suite of cost analysis based on what they knew was coming in the regulation of vehicles coming out of that provision. So that is a major reason why EPA says this needs to be revisited, and it seems rational and logical based on what we now know for the Supreme Court. Other errors that ensued from this standalone endangerment finding, divorced from standard setting in the rules. They actually, they picked 6 greenhouse gases that they defined as GHG, and turns out motor vehicles only emit 4 of the 6 that EPA addressed in 2009. So those are a couple examples, as well as the limited nature of the emissions that they point to. One other point I'll make, Michael referred to it, is this attempt by the current EPA to limit the potential interpretation of what an air pollutant that endangers is. The agency has now announced this interpretation that it's only air pollution with local and regional effects that is the type of air pollution that the endangerment finding should consider. And so those are the, when we're talking about the nitrous oxides, for example, that come out of the tailpipe, or carbon monoxide, we know that it has direct effects, local effects, regional effects. These are the types of pollutants that affect our nation's air quality. And so they propose that indirect contributions to global well-mixed pollutants that certainly have other factors by other emitters globally are not the type of air pollutants that were intended by Congress to be addressed in the Section 202. There, of course, there are a number of arguments there, but I think, again, back to Mass v. EPA, it's very clear that the Supreme Court says that GHG are air pollutants, and so I think EPA is going to get a lot of comments, most likely, on how to square that with Mass v. EPA, and where they land on that will, I think, be particularly interesting. So I don't know if I'm running short on time here, but I'll end it there and happy to take questions.
As my slides come up, let me start by thanking Ben Zycher for organizing this panel. He contacted me in, May, and said, you want to do something on that? And we didn't know all the drama that would happen between with the DOE report and so on. And this is a transition from the lawyers. I'm a policy guy. So, got my slides? That's not me.
Go ahead and use my slides if you want.
That's better. All right, let me say, from the standpoint of climate policy and greenhouse gas impacts, whatever you think the stakes are with respect to the endangerment finding, they're lower. This is a very symbolic act that may have high costs in terms of regulation, but in terms of affecting the trajectory of greenhouse gases, for a lot of reasons that I won't go into, however this comes out, it's probably not going to affect that trajectory. So I'm going to start with Saturday Night Live, as you should when talking about administrative law. This is a skit from 1984. If you know who Ed Asner is, you're of one generation. And if you know who Julia Louis-Dreyfus is, you're in another generation. So Ed Asner's retiring from running a nuclear power plant. And this is his going away party. And he says, right as he goes out the door, remember, you can't put too much water in a nuclear reactor. Everybody laughs, happy. He goes off to the beach. And then the skit is about how they interpret this term. Does that mean it's impossible to put too much water in a nuclear reactor? Or does that mean if you put too much in, there'll be a problem? Then at the end, they say, well, maybe it's you is the word we should focus on. Maybe the next shift can put water in there. A lot of this discussion of the endangerment finding has characteristics of this skit, and where people are trying to parse words and to determine exactly what they mean in the context of regulation. These are the words. You saw them before from Michael's presentation. This short section of the Clean Air Act. And what I'm going to do in my presentation is I'm just going to go through and talk about some of these words and explain to you. Number one, my view very much is, I agree completely with Michael, it is a Mount Everest. And I think the obstacles to overturning the endangerment finding are significant, and the risks are large, but to very little effect. And at the end, I'll come up with an alternative proposal for how things can be cleaned up and actually be effective as a matter of policy and regulation. So here's the things I'm going to talk about briefly. pollution, endangerment, science, Clean Air Act, and greenhouse gas regulation. So are greenhouse gases pollutants? The answer is yes, and it's not just Massachusetts versus EPA, but that's important. In that judgment, Justice Stevens, writing in the majority, called the definition of pollution capacious, which means enormously large. Justice Scalia was a little bit more colorful in his dissent, but he said the same thing. He said the definition of air pollution is so broad that it would include frisbees and flatulence. And he was not wrong. The definition is large. But even if someone wanted to challenge Massachusetts versus EPA, Congress has recently passed 2 notable laws that explicitly say greenhouse gases are a pollutant. That's the Inflation Reduction Act, which was led and voted only by Democrats, and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, interestingly, also defines greenhouse gases as a pollutant, led by Republicans. So there's ample congressional precedent for greenhouse gases being pollutants. Let me say, there is a poison pill in Massachusetts versus EPA. Michael mentioned water vapor. Water vapor is, in fact, a well-mixed greenhouse gas. If someone wanted to blow this up, they could sue EPA and say, we demand that you regulate water vapor. Humans emit a lot of water vapor. The global consequences of water vapor for global average surface temperature are not significant. But on a regional basis, things like irrigation, afforestation, there's a vast scientific literature on how human alteration of the Earth's surface through water, H2O, affects local and regional climates. And EPA would, under the same logic as carbon dioxide, be required to regulate water vapor. And this is actually in the EPA reconsideration proposal. There's a section on that. But a mischief maker out there could blow this up, because if you think regulating carbon dioxide is expensive, regulating water vapor is probably an order of magnitude larger. And that would force Congress to have to reconsider this issue. So what is endangerment? This is another one of those words that has a plain English meaning, but it also has a legal meaning. So this is from a 1976 court case, Ethel Corporation versus EPA. And in their judgment, they said the meaning of endanger is not disputed. A statute allowing for regulation in the face of danger is necessarily a precautionary statute. It's very clear that endanger means risk. They use this phrase, risk of harm. And so the Ethel decision, as should be apparent, the will endanger language of section 211C1A makes it a precautionary statute. And they are saying at this time, the administrator of EPA read it to mean a significant risk of harm. So it's very clear that endangerment is not necessarily someone's been killed or there's an immediate threat. I will say the Clean Air Act in multiple places modifies the word endangerment with some adjectives, but not in section 202. It's a much broader definition. I argue, from not a legal perspective, but from a policy perspective, this creates an exceedingly low bar. Risk of harm is not a high bar. And in fact, I think much of the discussions of climate science are totally irrelevant to exceeding this bar. If you look at Massachusetts versus EPA, this is all that was necessary to justify endangerment. In some, according to the petitioner's uncontested affidavits, the rise in sea levels associated with global warming has already harmed and will continue to harm Massachusetts. That's it. That's all that the Supreme Court judge was necessary to clear that bar of endangerment. So any discussions of hurricanes or heat waves or all those other things that are perfectly reasonable to talk about in the context of climate change are not relevant here because the capacious definition of the Clean Air Act. Massachusetts versus EPA also was explicit about what it would mean to rescind an endangerment finding. EPA can avoid taking further action only if it determines that greenhouse gases do not contribute to climate change. And this is, of course, is impossible to meet because greenhouse gases do contribute to climate change. It's very straightforward. So the scientific elements here, I think, are far, far less important than you might think from the public discussions. This entire issue will be settled in courts of law based on how much water you can put in a nuclear reactor. So the judgment was that if EPA makes a finding of an endangerment, which again has that very low bar, then the Clean Air Act requires the agency to regulate emissions. Now, it doesn't say what the substance of those regulations has to be. And here's where science becomes really important. Science becomes important in assessing the costs and benefits of alternative approaches to regulation. That's where we want to get into the weeds of, well, if you regulate new cars, how much carbon dioxide does that limit from the atmosphere? What effect does that have on things that we care about, like water resources and hurricanes and so on? So the science matters, but it doesn't matter for endangerment. It matters for cost and benefit analyses. There is a bit of a paradox in a lot of these discussions. You heard before that there was a discussion of what's called major questions, that the regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act is a really big deal. This is from the Bush administration's 2008 response to Massachusetts versus EPA, where they basically ran out the clock before the Obama administration came in. But they said the potential regulation of greenhouse gases under any portion of the Clean Air Act could result in an unprecedented expansion of EPA authority that would have a profound effect on virtually every sector of the economy and touch every household in the land. That sounds like a major question. But at the same time, others make the argument that it's a nothing burger. It makes no difference. It's de minimis. This is what the Trump administration said. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from new motor vehicles to zero would not have a scientifically measurable impact on global greenhouse gas concentrations and climate change. So what is it? Is it regulation of the entire economy, which is significant, and there's a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions? Or is it just so small that it's trivial? It can't be both. And that seems like that's going to be a problem going forward. Pick one. So I'm going to end with a modest proposal. I think that this is a great opportunity for the Republican Congress to propose to amend the Clean Air Act to include a section on greenhouse gas regulation. In the 1970s, it was discovered that chlorofluorocarbons affected the ozone layer. Chlorofluorocarbons go up in the stratosphere. They're not conventional air pollution. And in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, Congress created a new section regulating ozone-depleting substances. This is a great opportunity for Republicans to write a new section of the law, taking care of all these issues that these guys raised, put it out there in public, address issues like the social cost of carbon, the cost of regulation, and so on. And in the process, politically, take the lead on climate policy, take it away from the Democrats, and also force Democrats, if they so choose, to vote against a new provision on greenhouse gas regulation. It would be very difficult. Of course, there would be trade-offs and compromises, but there is no way for this issue to be resolved without, in my view, without Congress acting. We could go through a lot of court time and cases, and someone will win, someone will lose, but it's not going to make any difference on greenhouse gases. So whenever you hear about the Clean Air Act, just remember, you can't put too much water in a nuclear reactor.
Thank you. Okay. Let's see.
I think they have to take you backwards.
Okay, thank you very much. My answer is an emphatic yes. as to whether or not the greenhouse gas endangerment finding should be reversed. In order to justify that conclusion, I'm going to talk about the assertions, assumptions, and projections made by the EPA administrator in 2009 in comparison with the evidence on those assertions, et cetera, both before and after 2009. There's then the de minimis issue, which I think is more important than Roger seems to believe. I do want to talk a bit about the greenhouse gas emission scenarios underlying the endangerment finding. I want to talk briefly about the 2024 EPA multi-pollutant emission standards for reasons I'll get to, and then offer a few conclusions. What did EPA assert in the 2009 endangerment finding? They asserted there would be an increase in ground ozone smog. There would be an increase in the numbers and intensities of tropical cyclones, hurricanes. They claimed that there was some evidence of increasing intensities of Atlantic hurricanes. There would be an increase in flooding. There would be an increased likelihood of heat waves. There would be an adverse net impact on mortality from heat and cold. There would be more wildfires and drought. There would be adverse effects on both US and global food production. There would be adverse effects on US water quality, and there would be an acceleration in sea level rise and an increase in coastal storms. That's what EPA asserted, at least qualitatively, in the 2009 endangerment findings. So what do the data tell us? Well, for ground ozone, from 1980 through 2009 and thereafter, there's been almost a monotonic decline in the US. The hurricane numbers and intensities, there are no trends since the satellite record began in 1973 with respect to the Atlantic hurricane intensity trend beginning in 1967. That increased intensity trend is driven by three outlier years, 2005, 2010, and 2020. And when EPA, the administrator, asserted some evidence that there was an increased intensity of Atlantic hurricanes, that was based upon 1 year, 2005. Which tells us a great deal about the quality of the statistical analysis underlying the endangerment finding. With respect to global flooding, IPIC has low confidence for observed changes in the magnitude or frequency of floods at the global scale. For US flooding, there's been a lot of work in the published literature, and there's simply no correlation or statistically significant regression coefficient for greenhouse gas concentrations with respect to US flooding, Ryberg and Hirsch and other papers. With respect to heat waves, there's no trend in the EPA heat wave index beginning in 1895, except for the 1930s. I think Michael mentioned this as well. The US Climate Reference Network, which is a network of something like 130 meticulously maintained weather stations or temperature stations throughout the US, shows no temperature trend at all beginning in 2005. I'd be a little careful about using that data because there are only 20 years of it. I do want to mention one thing, if time permits. The heat wave argument is very, very strange. And I think IPIC's discussion of heat waves is very poor. And if Roger disagrees, I want to hear it. Standard textbook atmospheric physics does not predict an increase in average high temperatures as a result of increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. Standard textbook atmospheric physics predicts an increase in average lows, not average highs, because the effects of greenhouse gas emissions are predicted to occur or be observed rather in the coldest, driest air masses in the Northern Hemisphere in the winter, Eastern Asia and Western North America. You know, Steve Koonin in his book Unsettled, talks about this in some detail. Since 1900, there's been virtually no change in average highs. What there has been an increase in average lows, which is a very different phenomenon. And for some reason, this heat wave argument keeps getting repeated, and I don't understand what the scientific basis for it is. In terms of net mortality from heat and cold, there's been a lot of work in the literature, in particular 3 international studies published in The Lancet, reporting that cold-related deaths are at least an order of magnitude higher. For the US, annual heat and cold-related deaths are about 9,000 and 144,000 respectively. With respect to US wildfires, there's been a sharp decline since 1926 and no trend since 1985 in the number of US wildfires. Acreage in some data sets has gone up, but that clearly is a outcome of government forest management practices rather than greenhouse gas emissions. I was on one of the NPR radio stations some years ago debating climate issues with some robot from the Sierra Club, and this young lady kept insisting that the wildfire problem was caused by greenhouse gases. And so I asked her to explain why greenhouse gas emissions should create sharply greater wildfire problems in government forests than in private forests, and I got no straight answer to that question. In terms of the acreage of global wildfires, there's been about a 24% decline in the NOAA database since 1998. US drought, there's been no trend in the Palmer Drought Severity Index since 1895. Global drought, depending on which severity index you look at, there's been an approximate surface area decline since 1950 of about 0.5% per decade. Food production, the UN reports global per capita food production increased 40% since 1980, and for the US, the figure is about 15%. The General Accountability Office has published a lot of analyses of US water quality, and the general finding is that there's been general improvement over the last 50 years, but threats remain. That's a crude summary of the GAO findings. With respect to sea level rise acceleration, there's no clear answer in the literature. The tidal gauge, earlier tidal gauge data shows one average annual rise of about 1.9 millimeters per year. The satellite data, the alternative data, begin in 1992, and those data show about 3.3 millimeters per year. That's not an acceleration because the 2 data sets are not comparable. The July 2025 DOE draft report, which I guess is being withdrawn because of some litigation, and again, it's a draft, it's subject to comments and peer review and all the rest. It concluded, subject to comments and peer review, that the largest US increases are driven by land subsidence, that the extreme projections are driven by implausible extreme emission scenarios, in particular representative concentration pathway 8.5, which I'm going to return to in a minute. There is a new published paper showing no statistically significant acceleration globally. I think that my allies in the climate skeptic community have been a little too quick to jump to endorse that paper. The authors are very clear that for large parts of the globe, the data are really rather poor, and so I'd be a little careful. And at a broader level, whether or not there's been an acceleration is only one question. If there has been an acceleration, the next question is, to what degree is it natural, and to what degree has it been caused by man? No one knows the answer to that question. The point is that the data largely refute the assertions in the 2009 endangerment finding both in the years leading to 2009 and afterward. And so on that basis alone, in my view, the endangerment finding should be deemed arbitrary and capricious and repealed. There's then the de minimis issue, which EPA in 2029 recognizes explicitly. A truly trivial or de minimis contribution to air pollution might not support regulatory action. Well, if you use the EPA climate model, all US greenhouse gas emissions would have the effect of increasing global temperatures in the year 2100 by about 14/100ths of 1 degree. The standard deviation of the surface temperature record is about 1/10 of a degree. And so the effect of all not just Section 202A emissions, but all US greenhouse gas emissions would either be just barely statistically significant or not statistically significant, depending on how one structures the appropriate statistical test. If we eliminate all, not just Section 202A vehicle emissions, but all US vehicle emissions, the effect would be 32/1000ths of 1 degree. And obviously, greenhouse gas emissions from Section 202A vehicles, new motor vehicles and engines, would be vastly smaller. The premise that total US greenhouse gas emissions, let alone Section 202A emissions, may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare is simply not plausible. And that is why, in my view, the endangerment finding in 2009 deliberately conflated global total US vehicle and Section 202A vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards. On that basis alone, that conflation, I think that the endangerment finding, again, should be deemed arbitrary, capricious, and repealed. How am I doing on time here? Okay. Let me turn now to the EPA greenhouse gas emission scenarios. IPIC, in the 6th assessment report, if you look at the Working Group 1 report, the physical science basis, and turn to table 12.12, Roger has written about this, I have written about this independently. IPIC concludes that RCP 8.5 is a scenario, the likelihood of which is considered low. There's another very prominent analyst who's described RCP 8.5 as falsified and impossible. Who said that? Roger Pielke Jr., that's who said that. And the representative concentration pathways had not been invented in the literature by 2009. They were not really formally defined in the peer-reviewed literature, I think, until 2012 or 2013, something like that. And so in 2009, if you look at the endangerment finding, EPA used either implicitly or explicitly 9 scenarios for 2030 and 2100, 2 of which are even more extreme than RCP 8.5, and 6 others, of the remaining 7, 6 others yielded about double the warming in the troposphere in the satellite record. Without going into too much detail, under RCP 8.5, the average annual increase in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases from now through 2100 is almost 12 parts per million, on average every year. The average for 2000 through 2024, I think, was 2.3 parts per million. And the single biggest increase in the record in the NOAA database is for last year was 3.5 parts per million. And so the RCP 8.5, the average annual increase is 3.5 or 3.5 times greater than the single biggest increase in the NOAA database. That's how extreme RCP 8.5 is. I want to talk a bit about the 2024 EPA multi-pollutant emission standards not because it's directly relevant to our topic today, the endangerment finding, but because it illustrates the decades-long problems with EPA benefit cost analysis. And at this point, Matt, and I beg your forgiveness, I'm not holding you responsible for any of this. The 2024 multi-pollutant emissions standard was an obvious attempt to force a massive shift toward electric vehicles. And in the EPA benefit cost analysis, fuel savings are a major component of the benefit side, or the asserted benefit side of the rule. But EPA in 2024 did not talk at all about the quality of transportation services caused by a shift toward electric vehicles. And so in the EPA benefit cost analysis, if they were using that benefit cost methodology, if EPA were to finalize a rule outlining motorized transport and forcing everyone back into stagecoaches and horse-drawn wagons, there would be very, very significant fuel savings, but there would be no change in the quality of transportation services. So net benefits would be enormous. I kid you not, that is their benefit cost methodology. So implicitly, what EPA in their methodology is arguing is that the reason people buy fuel is because they're stupid. EPA in 2024 also claimed climate benefits, the present value of which were 1.6 trillion at a discount rate of 2%. This was independent. There was no effort to analyze the actual effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions on actual climate phenomena. Instead, EPA took the Biden administration estimate of the social cost of carbon, or the social cost of greenhouse gases, multiplied it by the asserted reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and that was the climate benefit. The Biden administration social cost of greenhouse gas calculation, forgive me for saying this, is the single most dishonest exercise in political arithmetic I have ever seen produced by the federal bureaucracy, for all kinds of reasons that I won't bother you with today. I list them here. The most important of which is an artificially low discount rate, in this case 2%. And that was justified on the grounds that the shift toward electric vehicles and more generally away from the fossil fuel related capital stock is merely a consumption shift. It's not an investment shift, which is just rather silly. Of course it's an investment shift. And the second rationale was that future generations cannot vote today. And so one way to take account of their interests is to use an artificially low discount rate, which is a fundamental fallacy. The interest of future generations is in a bequest of the most valuable possible capital stock, defined broadly. And in order for future generations to inherit the most valuable possible capital stock, you have to have efficient investment behavior by the current generation. Anyway, simply to conclude, the endangerment finding is simply not supported by the evidence on climate phenomena, both before and after 2009. US greenhouse gas emissions in total, US vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, and Section 202A greenhouse gas emissions are simply too small to reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. That's why the endangerment finding conflates it all. And in general, the analysis underlying the endangerment finding is exceptionally poor, and I think it ought to be reversed. So thank you very much. There's my email address. Feel free to send me comments, criticisms, witticisms, whatever. Thank you. Great.
Thank you to all our panelists for very insightful presentations, and thank you all for limiting your remarks to under 20 minutes, so that now we have more time for the panel discussion. So the first question I want to ask Matt and Michael, our two lawyers on the panel. The original finding was upheld by the DC Circuit Court. What kind of legal challenges might a new finding face? Could this be headed for the Supreme Court?
So there, I alluded, well, not more than alluded. I talked about several of the challenges that are there. One of the best things that they have is, and this is, if I'm gonna push back a little on Roger, like it doesn't say it says in the judgment of the administrator, it doesn't say in the judgment of Roger or me or any of the rest of us. And those kind of scientific judgments under that Coalition for Responsible Regulation case in the DC Circuit that upheld the original 2009 endangerment finding, under that case, and under many other cases, there's extreme deference for scientific findings and judgments that the agency makes. Now, that's sort of a two-edged sword, right? If it benefits the Obama administration and subsequent Democrat administrations, and presumably that should benefit the Trump administration too. I am not going to hold my breath for deference has been an important part of the administrative law revolution. Is we think about deference differently now. We should still think about scientific judgments the same, because the statute here says, hey, you administrator, make a judgment based on what you think, based on the facts and the science and whatever else you have in front of you. But I would not be surprised if the standards are maybe not the most equally applied, depending on the partisan affiliation of the administration that's going to court. It's just an unfortunate reality of our time. So that is a strong argument, but it is one that I think they're going to face pushback on. The legal arguments, I think, are a little bit harder because they are closer. There's just, the cases are kind of in different places, and they've chosen a pretty aggressive reading of limiting Massachusetts versus EPA, leaning more heavily into these more recent cases, and chances of the DC Circuit going their way on that, I think it's also an uphill battle. I think the Supreme Court has shown a willingness to take a lot of important environmental cases, a lot of important administrative law cases. If I were betting, I would, I don't know what I'd bet on the chances of getting cert, but I think there are, that's probably where this is going to go if this administration is going to prevail.
Yeah, I'll add, I think of the EPA approach as, a primary proposal or legal rationale, alternative proposal or scientific rationale. I think the agency, if, it is always on better footing, potentially, if it has a strong legal argument that reinterprets the cases. That said, this question of the extent to which they get scientific deference to their scientific views is fraught on this one. While the administrator's judgment on a lot of different issues, like the extent to which a toxic chemical affects human health, gets strong deference. The DC Circuit reasserted that recently in the Huntsman case. But it will be subject to arbitrary and capricious review. And some of the arguments that we heard previewed by Roger and Ben are going to be the arguments raised by the scientific community that might be pushing back on the report that we saw come out of the Department of Energy. So, judges, I think, are loath to wade in to make decisions like this. They'd much prefer to cling on to a legal principle than be the deciders for one of the most fraught environmental law questions of our generation. So, my sense is that EPA will probably likely lean into the legal strategies. DC Circuit's a hostile venue, and it's a play to get the Supreme Court's attention, which worked in there was a similar strategy in West Virginia v. EPA. So I think they're trying to run that playbook once again.
Can I follow up on that really quickly? A few things, Roger, that you said that I did want to push back on also on the legal points that I think is relevant to all this. One is that the definitional change, those changes in the Inflation Reduction Act and in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act don't change the language of Section 202A. They don't change the definition of pollutant. I think do muddy the waters somewhat, but I don't read into that any kind of formal acceptance or ratification of Massachusetts versus EPA's approach to it. I don't think the Supreme Court's going to I think they're unlikely to want to revisit Massachusetts completely, but I don't think that those changes have quite the relevance that you put on them. Also, I don't think the point that you made about the standard for when Massachusetts was talking about the risk to their coastlines and things like that, that was about standing and whether they could even get into court. It wasn't about the standard for endangerment. So simply having standing to go to court to say, hey, I have a risk of climate change, that's like a minimal, courts have for generations said any identifiable trifle, even if it's just a risk in the future, is sufficient to get into court and have standing. So they're different standards. And then the last point on major questions, I don't think there's an inherent tension there. So major questions ask whether the political and economic consequences of the issue are major, not whether the resulting change to one or some other thing is major, right? There was actually a question about this in West Virginia versus EPA, where they said, imagine it's about regulating tobacco, but the agency starts with just regulating hookah, right? Which is a very small part of how people smoke. And the court's point there and the ultimate decision was, if the subject matter is really important, you expect clarity. And I actually think here, the fact that the impacts are low, but the costs are enormous, tends to indicate that this wasn't what the law was made for, right? You would expect costs to be commensurate with some kind of benefit that you could see in the real world in the statute. So I think those 3 or 4 points are where I would differ, and I do think that those things are going to come up in the cases as they go forward.
Could I ask one before Roger responds to that too? Roger, I actually think the point you made about CFCs and ozone pollution actually cuts in favor of EPA here from a legal perspective. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was the crisis with the ozone layer. One would think that was an endangerment, but EPA didn't choose to regulate under Section 202A. Congress passed a new portion of the Clean Air Act in Title VI and created a whole new regulatory program. So, we've seen massive questions of global significance before, but Congress has stepped in. So, one might wield that argument to say that means 202A wasn't really intended for this similar global problem to the ozone issue.
Roger, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, far be it for me to argue with lawyers. But I'm happy to hear that these are the sort of things that are going to come up. I do want to throw, and I'll throw something else at you. So this is in the category of be careful what you wish for. So let's say the endangerment finding is rescinded, and the US government has no authority for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. Flash forward a couple of years, and President AOC declares a climate emergency. We know, thanks to the Trump administration, that declaring an emergency under legislated authority can be used all sorts of ways, and there's been debate about how appropriate that is. But the Clean Air Act does have a provision in it for the declaration by the administrator of an emergency situation, which would then circumvent all of this that we're talking about. And President AOC says, well, because the last administration rescinded the endangerment finding, we have no ability to control greenhouse gas emissions, and in my judgment, this endangers the public to such a degree that it's an emergency, and I am using my authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions across the entire economy. So I guess my question is, given what we've seen with the Trump administration, is that a plausible scenario?
I don't have the language in front of me, so I don't think so, because I think that emergency stuff is almost all about waiving otherwise applicable requirements. So it's a deregulatory thing, not a regulatory thing.
I think the language actually, it says that they can go to a court and ask for a judgment. to implement new actions,
Yeah.
to halt the pollution.
There is that, but then of course that's a check, right?
Right.
We do know that the Biden administration considered declaring a climate emergency and ultimately declined.
Right. Well, I think because
Right.
the consequences, if they did, then the response from his base would be, all right, regulate the whole economy. And I mean, that would have been a bad political decision for the Biden administration because it would have elevated expectations to a level they couldn't be fulfilled. But given, how many have we seen, 7 or 8 emergencies declared this year? It seems that there's again, this is in the absence of Congress acting to clean this up with a new provision in the law. There's just like the Trump administration is exploiting the law to try to get rid of the endangerment finding. The next administration could do the same sort of thing, and here we go again with the ping pong back and
I
forth.
just think that's always been the case, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I think Carl Schmitt was just objectively correct when he said the sovereign is he who decides the exception.
Right.
I think that is a correct statement of what sovereignty means, and I think that is vested in the president to a large extent.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for our panelists. I think it's a good sign that we're having back and forth. The next question is for Roger and Ben that might introduce even more back and forth, and Matt and Michael, feel free to chime in. So as we all know, you're both AEI scholars, used to work in academia. As I understand, there are some disagreements between the two of you on the scientific evidence regarding the endangerment finding. Ben, based on your presentation, you believe there's not sufficient scientific evidence to support the endangerment finding. Roger, you believe there's no scientific evidence that would support a repeal of the endangerment finding. How would you respond to each other's analysis? Ben, would you like to go first?
Yeah, Roger made the point that a reversal of the endangerment finding would require the new EPA administrator to find that greenhouse gas emissions do not affect climate phenomena. I don't think that's right, Roger. I think it would require the new EPA administrator to find that the 2009 finding of a reasonable anticipation of a threat to human welfare was not supported scientifically, which is not the same thing. I don't think you're right about that. I have not seen, I've gone through the endangerment finding in great detail. I've written down every assertion on climate phenomena or other sorts of asserted effects of greenhouse gas emissions and put aside the conflation of US versus vehicle versus Section 202 emissions. There is not a single one that is supported by the evidence, whether before 2009 or since. And if you think I'm wrong about that, Roger, I want to hear it. But I see no evidence in support of the scientific assertions made by Lisa Jackson in 2009. I just don't see it.
So I think our discussion here is less about disagreements about science than disagreements about the significance of science in the context of law and policy. This afternoon, 1 o'clock, the National Academy of Sciences is going to have a press briefing, and they're going to release their quick report that responds to the DOE report that just came out. And so the questions of, will courts be willing to make judgments about what is true and false in the scientific realm? Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I read a lot of legal cases, and the Supreme Court seems to me historically, not just this court, but to be really, really unwilling to make judgments of truth, preferring to rely on what does the law actually say. It's possible, but I cannot imagine that a Supreme Court will make a judgment. These scientific experts are right. The National Academy of Sciences is wrong. I just think that the threshold that was established in the Clean Air Act of risk of harm is so low that even if people disagree, you got the DOE folks, you got the National Academies over here, you can cherry pick which one is your favorite, but the existence of a diversity of views of science would support that, yes, there are reasonable people making reasonable judgments of risk of harm. I guess the last thing I'll say, as a matter of effectiveness, if I was advising this administration, I mean, sure, spend all the time you want arguing facts and science. That's probably not going to be the most straightforward route to more effective regulation, cost-benefit analyses that are actually solid, and ultimately a path forward on the regulation of greenhouse gases.
Ben, you were shaking your head.
Risk of harm, Roger, is not the legal standard for an endangerment finding. The legal standard is a reasonable anticipation of a threat to human welfare, human health and welfare. Those are not the same thing. I mean, you and I both have written separately about the discussion in the Working Group 1 Physical Science Basis report, in the 6th assessment report, of IPIC's summary of its view of climate risks. And if you look at table 12.12, which you've written about this, I've written about this, IPIC summarizes its view of the risks for 2050 and 2100, in which it has either medium or high confidence, every one of which is driven by RCP 8.5. And so, I mean, when you talk about risks, I mean, it strikes me there's a certain inconsistency in your argument, Roger. You're recognizing that even IPIC does not have much confidence, has medium and high confidence only in risks that are driven by an emissions scenario in which it describes as low, a likelihood that's low, but somehow any risk of harm, however small, justifies an endangerment finding. I don't think that's correct.
Roger, I'll let you respond, and then I'll move to the next question.
We're squarely into how much water can you put in a nuclear reactor territory here. But let's say, I mean, this won't mean anything, these are just words, but let's say we're on an RCP 4.5 trajectory, not the RCP 8.5, the higher trajectory. That doesn't mean that risk of harm goes from infinity to zero. It means that it's less. There's still a risk of harm. You don't have certainty about the future. I don't have certainty about the future. That's the challenge of climate change. The late Steve Schneider, climate scientist, said that the fundamental problem is we don't know if the effects are going to be large and significant or small and benign. And that's the definition of a risk management problem. So I don't think that the issue of risk of harm goes away. Use whatever language you want there, just because we have different views of the future than we did in 2009. And again, I throw this back to Congress. Clean it up, fix it, instead of forcing lawyers, administrative law experts, and courts to make judgments about the entire economy.
Thank you, Roger. I have one last question for the panel discussion. This is intended to be a very broad question, so then you can answer my question directly or allude to some of your colleagues' comments earlier. But I do want to reserve about 10 minutes for questions from our audience in person and online. So for all our panelists, beyond the legal and scientific aspects, what are the broader policy implications of reversing the finding? What would this mean for the future of US climate policy, the economy, and international agreements? Who wants to go first?
I'll take a stab at that. Climate policy at its most basic is an effort to shift resource allocation nationwide away from fossil fuels and toward unconventional energy. Again, at the crudest level, that would generate a massive wealth transfer, basically from Republican states to Democratic states, because it is Republican states that are tied more closely, as a crude generalization, to fossil fuels. In my monograph on the Green New Deal 5 years ago, whenever it was, I actually had an estimate of all this, who wins and who loses as a result of a forced shift toward wind and solar power. That is why Roger's point about the need for congressional action is correct. It's not quite clear to me why Roger doesn't apply that principle to 2009. Why are Republicans subjected to a standard, go to Congress, that the Democrats were not subjected to in 2009? I've not heard you address that question, Roger. The problem is that the wealth transfers are enormous, and without an endangerment finding, the politicization of the U.S. energy sector, defined broadly, will be lessened rather than strengthened. I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah, for a long time now, energy policy has been viewed as a subset of climate policy. And number one, we got that exactly backwards, but I think things are changing right now. Part of the challenge is that the United States is seeing demand growth in electricity again. Around the world, there's enormous demand for energy. It's trying to square the circle of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is an important priority, and providing everyone in the world, 8 billion plus people, with the energy services that we take for granted, is an enormous challenge. And I very much view the issues like the endangerment finding to be a complete distraction, a partisan waste of time. And again, I'll give you my copy of my 2010 climate book where I called for Congress to pass comprehensive energy policy reform. Nothing is going to happen until Article 1 of the Constitution is respected and Congress steps up and starts doing their job. And that probably requires a president who looks to Congress as a co-equal partner in governing. And so, honestly, this is kind of a mess. And the world's going to move ahead. Energy infrastructure is going to be built out around the world. Nuclear, solar in particular, natural gas as well. If the lowest hanging fruit for emissions reductions around the world is to replace dirty coal plants with nuclear and natural gas, that squares with the Trump administration's priorities to have trade deals. Go to other countries that have dirty coal plants and say, hey, we're gonna make a deal with you. We're gonna provide LNG, we're gonna provide advanced nuclear. There are estimates that by closing just the 30 dirtiest coal plants, you can reduce global emissions of carbon dioxide by 10%. So there are things that can be done, and I guess my concern, again, as a policy analyst, is that we're spending a lot of our policy effort on issues that don't matter much.
I mean, my view of climate policy is it's inherently global. And if you are not coming up with solutions that have a global impact, you're playing just a game of whack-a-mole. If you make things so tightly regulated here, they will be made elsewhere. People will move elsewhere if we degrowth the economy and we actually do the kind of, degrowth communism idea that some folks in the climate left have pushed. Like, people just won't live that way. They will leave, or they will just break the law. And so unless you're willing, and us just decarbonizing also doesn't change the rest of the world's behavior, and then it makes very little difference, especially with this whack-a-mole phenomenon of, carbon leakage, as it's sometimes called. So, I don't think anyone's proposing making nuclear war on China and India to, force them to decarbonize like Thanos style. Like, that is not, right? That's like, if you wanted to decarbonize like that would work, right? Sonia Sotomayor said in Massachusetts, or in West Virginia versus EPA, at the argument that it would be great if we get rid of all sources of carbon dioxide emission. Of course, that's everybody, and every animal too. And those, that doesn't work. So in my view, trying to regulate emissions is the wrong way of looking at this. We should be looking at innovation and in investing in new technologies and in making it easier to innovate and promoting American leadership. Natural gas is a great example. Nuclear is a great example. It's not original to me. I don't know who first said it, but the Iron Age didn't begin because people outlawed bronze and said we need to have bronze regulation. And the Stone Age didn't end because people said, that's enough with those, Paleolithic tools. We're moving to edged weapons with bronze and copper and whatever. the world changes based on the needs of the moment and our ability to innovate. And that is the only way forward that I see, given the geopolitical challenges that you have with climate policy. So I agree completely with Roger. This stuff is all a distraction. It isn't going to make a difference, right? I think the scientific debates about, like, well, how do you even show it does anything? This is more, the impact here is beneath the level that we are even able to make confident predictions about at any level. Like, that all shows that we're, I think, approaching it the wrong way. And a fundamental reorientation, which is what I think this is about. That's why I say the symbolic importance here is significant.
The reality that the effects are trivial does not mean that the costs are trivial.
No.
Those are not the same thing.
No, you actually literally can flush money down the toilet, and you can do the same thing by doing stupid regulations.
Yeah. A lot of good points have been made. Agree, certainly, this is a global problem. I think folks on either side of this issue agree with that, right? And certainly the Biden administration tried to accelerate efforts to address it on the international stage. And it does seem to cry out for a legislative solution, because I think another point that both sides would agree with is the tools that EPA have are inadequate. I think, maybe a couple hit points from history. I think President Obama did try to push a major cap and trade bill on Capitol Hill that ultimately failed. And I think that the endangerment finding was a fallback position for them. It wasn't their primary proposal. But, when the Democrats have had control of government, they have tried to enact legislative solutions, and I would propose that they did pick their preferred course of action in the IRA. And what's interesting when you look at what the Democratic prescription for this policy problem was, it was carrots, not sticks, right? That is the pathway that they chose at great cost to the economy, and which is why now this Republican Congress has rolled a lot of that back. And this goes to Ben's point, is like, at what cost are we going to address these problems? But even when Democrats had that choice, they chose carrots, not sticks. And the endangerment finding and EPA command and control authority is the ultimate stick. But just EPA sees itself as, and has historically, as technology forcing, right? Even if technology doesn't exist today, we're doing these rules because we're going to force industry to come up with the technology, and then eventually it will, create economies of scale, and it'll be cheap, and it will work. They tried that here. It hasn't worked. I think what we need in EPA is an honest broker that looks at science, doesn't fudge on the science, but also doesn't fudge on the costs, right? And that's why coming out of the agency, I think a fair-minded, fulsome cost-benefit analysis of, like, sure, this is an environmental problem, but at what cost are we going to address it? What can the American economy afford? How is this going to affect consumers? Because there's been a lot of monkeying around, if you will, with how vehicles are being treated, how incentives are being pushed, how consumers are being affected. And I don't think that those mechanisms, which have largely played out through EPA regulation, have been the most efficient use of our investments in economy. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. We'll open it up to the audience for questions. Please keep your question precise and directed to a specific panelist or all of them. Yes.
Thank you. Myron Ebell, American Lands Council. Ben, I agree with everything, so I can't ask you a question. Both Mr. Bushbacher and Dr. Pielke have said that this is symbolic. Mr. Bushbacher, symbolic in a good way, and Dr. Pielke, it's just useless. It's just merely symbolic. But you said that if we just drop this, we could then have Congress create a useful program to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. I would put it the other way. if we get rid of the endangerment finding, which has polluted our political discourse as well as hampered our economy, we could then have Congress say explicitly that there is nothing in the Clean Air Act or any other legislation to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, period. We're not going to do it. Because some of you seem to think that this is a problem that needs government solutions. I think what Ben's evidence shows is that it's not a problem and it doesn't need government solutions. We can have energy policy if we just get rid of climate policy.
Well, I don't think it's accurate to say that the Clean Air Act does not deal with greenhouse gases at all. Section 136, for instance, has a specific fee for methane emissions. There are other provisions. The renewable fuel standards in Title II of the Clean Air Act are expressly designed to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels by blending in ethanol, those kind of things. So it's there, and it's important because of those preemption points I mentioned. I do not think that there needs to just be more and better new laws. I mean, I think we should do stuff, but I think we should do things by funding innovation and making it so you can actually build stuff in the US. Because I think a strong energy sector, a strong industrial sector in the US is the key. This is what Vice President Vance said during one of the debates with former VP Harris was, if you wanted to decarbonize, why aren't you bringing manufacturing back to the US, right? So I'm not a scientist, and I don't think that there are no risks here and with climate change, but I don't think some sort of comprehensive cap and trade or emissions program is at all a good idea.
Yeah. Let me say one thing that and Myron, thanks for coming. Good to see you here. One thing that's important to recognize, that if you look at the carbon dioxide intensity of the economy, so technically it's carbon dioxide over GDP, that ratio has been declining consistently for the past 30 years. There is no evidence that so-called climate policy has an effect on that downward trend. However, that downward trend is associated with more efficiencies in business, greater GDP, the expansion of the economy into new sectors like AI and computing. It turns out that the decarbonization of the economy is a fantastic byproduct of doing things that we want to do anyway. And so you can call it climate policy or not climate policy, but going forward, we want to do things that lead to that ratio still going down. Now, if you take that straight line from 1965 to today, and you just say, hey, I'm going to extend that into the future, when do we hit net zero? The answer is like 2085. So understanding why the economy has been decarbonizing and why that's good for our economy is something that I think we're missing. So you don't have to call it climate policy, call it industrial policy, call it economic growth policy. But we should be putting in place those policies that ensure that that long-term trend can continue. Not necessarily just because we like straight lines, but because of all of those other things that are accompanying decarbonization of the economy. So when people say, well, I don't like climate policy, call it something else, but recognize that there's a lot going on in our economy that doesn't happen by magic. It happens because we purposely try to be more efficient and we try to generate economic activity using less energy.
Ben.
Well, Roger seems to believe, if I'm hearing him correctly, that greenhouse gases are somehow bad.
You don't even have to believe that they're bad. The decarbonization of the economy has occurred no matter what you think about.
I understand that, but you're applauding it, and if it's a market-driven process, fine. I have no objection to it, but a certain minimum atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide is necessary for life itself. At what point does carbon dioxide get transformed from something that guarantees plant life can survive into a pollutant? I've never heard an answer to that question. And there are potential costs associated with increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, and there are important benefits: planetary greening, agricultural productivity, a net reduction in net mortality from heat and cold. And so to the extent that a reduction in the greenhouse gas intensity of the economy is driven by market forces, I couldn't agree with you more, Roger, but that does not mean that decarbonization in and of itself is a good or bad thing. That's a separate question.
So one of the mistakes that was made by the environmental movement and the climate lobby was to focus so narrowly on climate change and carbon dioxide emissions. I can propose, and in fact I have, my book makes a wonderful Christmas gift for that special someone in your life. I can propose an effective climate policy without using the words climate or carbon dioxide. I mean, this is one of those things that we have to recognize is that the global energy system is massive, it's interconnected. Climate change is one leg of what I call a four-legged stool. If you don't like that leg, don't talk about it. There's still three other legs. Stool stands up. And so I think the narrow focus over the science of climate change in this country, in Australia, in the UK, has just been a huge obstacle to common sense, bipartisan action on energy policy that is good for the economy, good for our country, and we're kind of hamstringing ourselves by these silly debates.
And to what extent, Roger, do you believe the environmental left is driven by a pursuit of sensible policy rather than an ideological opposition to fossil fuels narrowly and modern industrial society, modern industrial economics more generally? What do you think is their goal?
Yeah, I'll give you a short.
Roger, let me interrupt, sorry.
Please.
Give about 10, 20-second response, and I would suggest Ben probably organize another event for a longer form debate.
Yeah, real fast.
We do want to take one more question before the event concludes. Roger.
Okay, real fast. Rui Teixeira and I did a poll last year of the American public on what they think about climate and energy. Yes, there's people on the far left. Yes, there's people on the far right. Almost everybody in this country is in that big fat middle part of the bell curve. They want cheaper energy, they want cleaner energy, they want it secure, they want it reliable. It's, I would prefer to forget about the fringes and let's focus where most people are. All right.
One more question. No question? I thought really hard for you guys to ask. Okay.
May I follow up on that last point you made, Roger, about public opinion in the center, the rational center, we'll call it. I think over the last 30 years, we've done a good job of educating people on what the politically correct answer is on environmentalism. And I think, to be fair to everyone who has an opinion there, they've been misinformed about what the facts are and what the options are. So if you were trying to, I'm not sure whether to say persuade or better inform that rational middle, what would you have them focus on in the next 4 years?
Yeah, so the one aspect of our poll that was most surprising to me is we asked 100 questions, but one of them was how people perceive the framings of energy policy. And it turns out the most popular issue, this is the only question we asked where we had a majority of support across every demographic, every age, every political leaning, and that was an all of the above approach to energy policy. All of the above could be all of the above with an asterisk. In some places, wind's not great and solar's not great, and people are afraid of nuclear. But people like that. Yesterday, I testified before Congress, and the ranking member from New Mexico, Democrat, she said, we need an all of the above energy policy. It was invented by Obama. It's very popular. So starting with the idea that energy policy is not a team sport. Like, all right, we got the wind lobby, we got the nuclear lobby, we got the fossil fuel lobby, and starting with the idea that, all right, we need a big tent because we're gonna need a lot of energy going forward, is where I would start. There has to be an overwhelming bipartisan consensus on a whole bunch of matters of energy policy in this country. And a lot of times we spend our effort on energy policy trying to divide people. Oh, I hate wind, I hate solar, I'm scared of nuclear. Whereas if we talked about energy policy comprehensively over the next few years, at least we'd have a more informed, smarter discussion.
Can I have one thing, which is, like with COVID, I think, the scientific community has beclowned itself and has undermined its privileged authority as a voice in public discussion. I think that's not a new thing. I think I'm a little bit of an accelerationist with that. I think the Maha movement is an interesting sort of, well, what happens next after you destroy the credibility of the experts? It's not like they've just ignored science entirely. Actually, those folks are more interested in, there are confusions and problems with that too. And we're gonna have that with climate and energy policy, I'm sure, as we go forward. But demolishing and undermining the credibility of nonsense does open, it's sort of a forest fire that clears the field for new stuff to grow. I think it's going to take time, but I do think now's a very important opportunity for building the institutions that will be the honest brokers that can speak, be honest about the risks, benefits, and what the science does and doesn't say. I think that's very important.
Thank you very much. We're right on time. Thank you very much to all our panelists for the insightful discussions, and thank you all for attending. This concludes our event.
Very nice.
Thank you,
Thank
Roger.
you.